Alright, so this video is going to be a fun one, nothing serious, you'll understand pretty soon, but many of you have asked me about multi-weapon combinations with Techter. What are the cool, creative, wand, and even Talis multi-weapons that Techter can take advantage of that is not jet boots? Of course, the answer is nothing. And so basically we can end the video now. That was just a joke. This isn't because there aren't any weapons that on paper outshine jet boots, because there are in many respects. The issues come down to practice. So for this video, we're going to throw out the current constraints of NGS's multi-weapon system and just use our imagination and discuss what if. But first, we need to take a quick history lesson and rewind the clock about a year to this date. The PSO2NGS closed beta, or CBT for short. For those who do not know, the CBT was a different game in regards to multi-weapons that some would argue would have been better than the current system, though to be fair, it did bring its own problems. So what was the CBT multi-weapon system? The big difference was that your main weapon dictated the attack stat for the entire multi-weapon. Now what does this mean? For example, wand is a tech weapon, which requires tech augments to enhance its damage. This is no different than the current state of NGS. But in the CBT, if you were to multi-weapon, say a sword as your sub-weapon to wand, that sword would also be enhanced by tech affixes. This is no longer the case in the current state of NGS. Tech augments enhance tech weapons, and strike augments enhance strike weapons, so on and so forth. As it stands, this decision, for whatever reason, impacted the state of multi-weapons for the time being. And I want to make that clear. At this time, mixing damage types is not optimal, but that's more due to the weaknesses of hybrid augments more than anything else. So if this were to change, we would definitely have to come back to this conversation. Now, why did things change in the closed beta? Well, one reason that people will always point to was the Techter closed beta Shifta, which was 10% potency versus what is currently 5%. And the main class weapon boost wasn't there, making Techter the meta class for any weapon, as there really were no damage detriments. Now, I won't go on the record and say that Techter and its CBT Shifta was the reason why they changed multi-weapon, because it likely was not, especially when we look at the emergence of main class skills that I would say are more valuable than 10% increased potency from Shifta, or even the 10% main class weapon bonuses. If you've watched any of my previous videos, I like to talk about the Hunter skill, Perfect Parry Advanced, or Perfect Avenged Parry Advanced, that gives invulnerability frames when you successfully execute an Avenged Photon Art. In my opinion, there is no Shifta boost or main class bonus that is more valuable than this skill. Now, if I were to point out what was the reason that really impacted multi-weapons, it's probably a couple of things. The first thing is that NGS is free to play, and having a more streamlined augment path where you could just slap on one damage type and literally level all of your classes with, say, a wand sword and then multi-weapon that to a wand katana, so on and so forth. That's likely something Sega didn't want because essentially affects their bottom line. When you don't have to grind as much, when you don't have to work as hard because you've made one great weapon, there's really no enticement for people to use the player market, for folks to make more money. And one of the great ways to make more money or even use the player market effectively is through AC scratch. So that's probably one reason why they adjusted it. They did it because they want to get more of your money, or at least try to get more of your money. The other reason is that Sega likely overplayed their hand and thought players would like to play with more than one class. If you remember a while back in a couple of headlines, they kind of got caught off guard by the fact that the number of players using 3 or more classes was very low. So in the current state, you can multi-weapon, say, a sword and katana, because both of those weapons have strike affixes, and so you could level Hunter and Braver. And then once you got Braver to its max level, you could re-multi-weapon the sword to, say, twin daggers, and have an effective way of leveling Fighter. Not to say that you wanted to use the sword, but you could essentially just use the twin dagger and using the sword because you put all of your latest and greatest affixes on it. So while that is a nice quality of life, Sega didn't want you just to be able to do that once. They at least wanted you to do that twice or 3 times. So I would say they probably made these changes as a balance between sticking it to the player and making money, which isn't really balanced, but you know what I mean. But of course, the point of this video is to ignore all of that I think it's just important that we understand how we got to this point of wanting more multi-weapon combinations, because there's a lot of decisions that were made that kind of crippled the system, and now we just have to use our imagination and hope for changes in the future. So let's talk about some of those possibilities for Techter if you were to multi-weapon with different weapons, whether they be strike, range, or potentially another tech weapon. Wand Partisan. For those who have followed me over the last year, believe it or not, my first NGS video was around this time. Wand Partisan was my go-to multi-weapon until reality kicked like a donkey. And fun fact, pound for pound, donkeys can kick 2 to 3 times harder than a horse. Why could this work if we were to ignore the current rules of NGS? And that comes down to physical downs and Vogue Raptor. In its ideal state, Vogue Raptor could be triggered through wand attacks, causing physical down or even element down, given wand is a tech-based weapon, or could operate off of wand element explosions, or lack thereof. As we discussed in my more recent elemental down guide, the importance for Techter is to balance both element and physical downs, Vogue Raptor being an important tool for that balance. Of course, Hunter Venge is great as well, but if wand damage were up to snuff, the value you'd get out of Venger probably wouldn't be as important as using Vogue Raptor. Wand and Wired Lance. This one actually still has value as an off weapon. What I mean by that is this is not your primary weapon, you swap to it when you need it, and then you swap back to your main damage dealer. If you didn't know, you might be new to NGS, but back in the early days, the Alio patch, Wired Lance was one of the only weapons that provided something that other weapons did not, and that was reach and mobility. So let's say you were fighting Daedals and you wanted to hit the core. It was very difficult to not only reach the core on his chest or even its back, but stay there without Wired Lance. Fun fact, you don't need Hunter to use Wired Lance. When you're using weapons that don't belong to your main class or subclass, you can still use things like their weapon action if you multi-weapon it to a wand. So even though I'm not a hunter, I can't natively use Wired Lance, I can multi-weapon to a wand because I can use that wand and have access. As the game changed, we got Wand Lover's Line Force, which for 30 seconds allows us to essentially track the target, even though it's not at perfect, doing the same thing. What I will say though is that, say wand gets a damage boost and we can remove that reliance off of jet boots, this might be something to think about, because we do want to use Wand Lover's Line Force with more tactics. You don't want to use it all the time against all the bosses. There are situations to where it's better to hold off and wait for certain sequences or to wait for certain phases. And so having Wired Lance at your disposal so you don't have to burn Wand Lovers when you don't need to is probably something that, if wand gets its damage, is something to think about. Wand plus double saber. Now this is the original Surging Impulse from a conceptual standpoint. Yes, before Surging Impulse and all that drama a couple of weeks ago, we technically already had it if the game allowed us to use it the way that I think we should have, given a multi-weapon system. Now there's a lot of layers to this one. The first one is the Double Saber Whirlwind, acting as your passive source of damage for wand. The second thing is Deadly Archer. The third thing was Saber Parry Counter. One of the great things about Double Saber is that it does not require the normal attack button to initiate a counter. So not only does it save you palette space, you can now use the Double Saber weapon action to counter and produce a Whirlwind. So in an ideal world, you could build Whirlwind with Double Saber counter, but also maintain it with wand attacks. That's something you can't do in the current state of NGS. The only thing that builds and maintains Double Saber Whirlwind is Double Saber, which I do think is a bit of a letdown. You know, I'm not expecting wand or any other weapon to build it, but at least maintain it while it's getting that passive damage. And of course, the trade-off is you can slowly build up that Whirlwind to level 2, or in certain situations, you can burn it for Deadly Archer for that additional burst damage. Unfortunately, Sega completely wrecked this idea in the current multi-weapon system because there's no way to maintain Whirlwind, so there's no reason why you would use wand if you're going to be using Double Saber. And that's unfortunate because if you could even have the same hybrid augments and still get value out of this combination. Talis Launcher or Rifle. This is all about PP efficiency and was a combination I used a little bit in the early days of NGS, of course before reality kicked in. Now without Ranger as a subclass, rifle loses its value because essentially you're using rifle for rifle grenade. Once again, we're really focusing on PP. Even though Talis is very PP efficient, you can burn through your PP fairly quickly, especially as Techter. Now, launcher weapon, actually also known as the sticky bomb, like the wired lance, does not have this restriction, and so technically this still works today to some degree. The main issue is that when you aren't using launcher to trigger the sticky bomb, you're going to lose 50% of that PP value that you would normally get. So with launcher triggering sticky bomb, you'd get like 100 PP. Using a multi-weapon such as Talis, you're only going to get 50 PP. Now that's not bad given the fact that if you did have Ranger as a subclass, you would be getting 50 PP every 30 seconds, which isn't bad. Once again, the issue is damage. Talis does not have the damage, and really without weak bullet, you wouldn't be getting much damage from launcher or rifle as well. But in an ideal world, this is a very powerful combination. Now, fun fact, before moving on to the last combination on our list, I want to talk about overemphasis and what could have been a powerful combination for both Partisan's Photon Art Javelin and Launcher's Photon Art Fury Racer. These two Photon Arts are channel abilities. What that means is that as long as you have PP, these two abilities will continue to pump out damage. Once you run out of PP, the effects cancel. So you think, wow, I can just hold the Fury Racer button. With Sticky Bomb, I'd get that PP back, and then when my PP depletes again, I could use Overemphasis as Techter and get even more PP in a longer duration on, let's say, Avenge Javelin, which is pretty good damage, or Fury Racer. Too bad for whatever reason, Overemphasis cancels these channel type Photon Arts. So if you're holding down the button for Fury Racer or for Javelin, and you activate Overemphasis, it cancels the Photon Art and you'd have to reapply it. I figured I'd call that out just as an FYI, and in the rare situation that Sega's listening, of course they aren't, but if they are, you should really look at Overemphasis and just make that tweak because it's kind of pointless that it can cancel abilities like that. For the last combination, and this is going to be both Techter weapons, Wand and Talis, Soaring Blades. Now this is the last one on the list. There are others, but they're not as creative or diverse, but this one's really hard to discuss due to all of the issues with Fanatic Blades or Photon Blades because it's gone through a lot of changes, a lot of issues. But just looking at the Photon Blades from a concept standpoint and its utility for Techter, very strong in PP, weaving in for both Wand PAs and even Talis attacks. And so it felt like a no-brainer. The issue is how Soaring Blade weapon action or Photon Blades are now triggered. But if it didn't have these issues, it would be an interesting conversation and a combination because it still gives you access to jet boots. Now, of course, I promised I wouldn't talk about jet boots, so I'm just gonna leave it there. And that's my list. There are some other weapon combinations, but I feel like they kind of lack creativity when it comes to Wand or Talis, or they really rely on just exploiting a class skill and really don't add anything to Techter as a whole. For example, I would add Braver Combat to that list. It's not really add anything, it's just a nice burst attack every minute if you level the skills up accordingly. Once again, this was just using our imagination if the multi-weapon system was more flexible. There's a lot more guide-based content that you've all asked for that we'll start getting back to soon, but I figured this question just kept coming up, and so let's have some fun. Other than that, let me know your ideas, your combinations, and all that you've tried, whether they're Wand and some other weapon or just weapons in general below in the comments, and I'll catch you next time.